Alright, welcome to part 2 of the chest tutorial. So in the last one we got it set up so that you could walk up to the chest and it will detect at the top left when you get close to it and when you move away from it. But obviously we don't want to just print out a string. We want to show a little widget above the chest that says, hey, you can press the E key or whatever to search it. And if you remember from the video that I showed at the beginning, let me just go back and run it real quick. This is my other project. So if I run it and I walk up, you can see it pops up this little widget, and there's this little circular progress bar. As I hold down E and let go, it charges up this progress bar. And I thought this would be a cool thing to include because I see a lot of games do stuff like this. So the next thing we're going to do is actually create that little widget that is a circular progress bar. So to do that, we need to import our other asset. So back here in the content directory, go to the asset folder again, and I want to drag in one more asset. So come back here to this folder that you downloaded, and then back up here, we're going to drag in this circle, just like that. And let me double click on it here to see if we need to edit anything, because I can't remember. Yes, so this compression settings, we need to change it to user interface. And we want to change the texture group to UI. And we're doing this because it's going to be shown on the UI, obviously. And so it needs to have different settings. And we can just save that and close it. And then from this, we want to create a material. So if you right click on it and say create material, we will call this the M for material underscore circular progress bar. So if we double click on this, we can open it up for editing. So this might be a little bit confusing. I'm not super familiar with materials. I don't use them a lot. I actually kind of figured out how to do this by following another tutorial. So I'm mostly just going to be telling you guys what to do to get this to work. And if I don't have the best explanation for why it's working this way, I'm sorry. But it's really not that complicated. So the first thing I want to do is select this guy over here on the right. And on the left, we want to change the material domain to user interface, since we're going to be using it as a UI object. And we want to change the blend mode to translucent. And so you can see that simplifies this guy a lot. So up here, first thing we want to do is we want to add like the background circle so that we can see where the ring is. So we're going to take this value, and if you hold down the 3 key and left click, it'll create a constant 3 vector. And then if we right click on this and say convert to parameter, we can make it a parameter. And I'm going to call this the background color. So we want to take the RGB from this and multiply it by this background color. So if we drag off of here and say multiply and hook it up to this, and I just hit this button to kind of show what's going on. See, it's multiplying this color by this color, and it's just giving us black since this is all black. But if you change the background color, so let's change the default color to like a gray color, so like 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, and hit OK. You can see now we have a gray circle, and maybe we should make it a little bit darker because that's kind of too bright. It's like 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, something like that. And then we can drag this, and well, we'll just keep that up there for now because we're going to be adding to it here in a second. So this is just the background, but we actually want to make it so that it charges up. So we're going to use another one of these. So if you just copy and paste this guy and then rename it to, it's letting me type here, foreground color. So this is going to be the foreground color or the charge color. And I'm just going to make this white. You can make it whatever color you want. Doesn't really matter. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to do a multiply, like so. And then we want to multiply this by another value, so we'll do another multiply. And then this is where it's going to get a little tricky. So I'm going to come over here a little bit because we're going to need a little bit of room. We want to use the text coordinate, and we're going to take this value, and we're going to use a function called custom rotator. And for the rotation center, if we drag off of this, or actually I think if we just hold down 2 and left click, it will create a constant 2 vector. And we want to set this to 0.5, 0.5, so that it will be the center of the circle. And then for the rotation angle, we want to use 1 or 0.25. So if you hold down 1 and left click, it'll make a constant variable and set the value to 0.25. We'll hook that up to the rotation angle. And then from there, we want to call add. And we want to add another constant. So hold down 1 and left click to create a constant, hook it up to B. And we'll call this, or we'll set this to negative 0.5. Just to click this to kind of show what's going on. And then after that, we want to use another function called vector to radial value. And then we want to take the result of the vector converted to angle, and we want to add. And then we're going to be adding the percent value to this. So if we hold down 1 again and left click, and then this one we want to make a parameter, so right click and say convert to parameter. And I'm going to call this the percent. It'll let me type percent. Lock that up to B. And it's like this. So you can see it's kind of giving us that circle effect that starts at the top and then goes around this way. And we want to floor this like so. And then we want to take this value and multiply it into here. So if we hook it up and then we hit the drop down on this, kind of see what's going on. And then once I set up percent, it will make a little bit more sense what's going on. And then we want to just add these two values together so the background gets added to the foreground. So we'll say add and hook that value up. And that's going to go into our final color. And we want to set the opacity to this RGB color like that. So right now it just looks like this gray circle. But if we come over here to our parameter defaults and we change the percent to like 0.25, you can see it fills up 0.25 up the bar. Maybe like 0.5, it fills up half the bar. And so you kind of get the idea of how this is working. And of course, you can set these foreground and background colors to be whatever you want. I might make this one a little bit darker still, just because I don't want it to like conflict with the foreground color. I'm going to do 0.05. There we go, something like that. So there we have our circular progress bar. And you want to make sure that you set the percent over here, the default value, to 0 once you just test that it's working. That way, you know, when it initially shows up in the game, it will start out at 0. And then make sure you hit apply and save once you have everything finished. Okay, so now we have this cool little circular progress bar. We can make use of it. So we want to use this material inside of a widget. And that widget is what we're going to show on top of the chest. So if we come back here to our content folder, we want to right click and go to user interface and make a new widget blueprint. And I'm going to call this the search widget because it's that little widget that pops up that says search. And we can double click on this to edit it. And over here on the left in the hierarchy, we want to kind of change some things. So the first thing we want to do is we want to delete this canvas panel because we don't need that. And we want to replace it with a size box. So drag in a size box. And if you select the size box, we want to select width override and height override. And we're going to set it to 200 by 90. And then just to kind of see what that looks like, if we change this up here to custom, we can specify what we want to view this widget as. And we'll also set it to 200 by 90. So this is the dimensions of our widget, just so we can kind of see it correctly as we edit it. And then the next thing we want to do is add a border. So we have a nice background color. So come up here and hit border and drag it down to the size box. And by default, it has a white background, but we want like a kind of dark black transparent one. So for the brush color, we want to set this to 0, 0, 0, and like 0.5, something like that. So it's a little bit transparent. Compile, save. And then after that, we want to make a horizontal box because we're going to have the circle indicator on the left and then some text on the right. So we want to use a horizontal box for this. So search for horizontal box and drag that into the border. And we want to remove this padding because we don't actually need it. So set that to 0. And then we want this to be stretched, which it already is, so that's good. And the next thing we want is a uniform grid panel. And this is going to be where our circular progress bar lives. So we'll add that. That's going to be on the left. And then on the right, we want to have our text. So drag in some text to the horizontal box. So you should have the horizontal box, which has the uniform grid panel on the left and the text on the right. So if you click on the uniform grid panel, inside of here, we want to add a couple more things. So we want to add another size box. So drag that onto the uniform grid panel. And then we want to add our circle image. So search for image and drag that onto the size box. And then the last thing we want is inside of this uniform grid panel, we want another text. So drag it onto the uniform grid panel. Okay, so it looks a little bit ugly right now, but it should look something like this. We want to change the size box, so click on the size box. We want to set it to be centered and centered. And then we want to set the width override and the height override, so check both of those and set it to 50 and 50. And then select on this image. And I'm going to press F2 to rename this to the circle image. And we want to also set this to centered and centered. And then the next thing we want, oh wait, actually no, we want to set this to, sorry, keep it as is. We want to set it to stretched the whole way across. And then select this guy. And so this is going to be our little E key. So set the text of it to just say E. And then we want to set this to stretched as well, I believe. No. We want to set this to centered and centered. So you can see it's centered inside of the circle there. And then we want to set the font size to, actually I think 24 is probably good. And then finally we want to set this search text on the right. We want to rename it to search. Or not rename it, but we want to give it the text of search. And we want to set it to fill. And we want to set it to centered and centered. Like so. All right, so now we need to actually set this little white box over here to be our circle image. So if we select it, and then we expand this brush thing, and we select image, and we search for our m underscore circle progress bar, you can see it shows up. And I believe I had some padding in my other project. So maybe on this guy, where did I have this? I never remember where to add padding. Let me look at my other project real quick. Yes, so on the uniform grid panel, we want to add padding to the left so it's not like right up against the side. So I'm just going to add a padding of 10 and scoots it over a little bit. So there we have our little search widget complete and ready to go. But we need to add some functionality to this so that we can, be able to set this circle inside of code, how much or how full it is. So go back to the graph tab, and inside of here we want to add some stuff. So we can actually just delete this because we don't really need these. I'll save. And we want to add some other events. So the first one we want is inside of the event on interact. So go ahead and add that event on initialized. Go ahead and add that. And in order to modify that circle, since it's a material, we need it to be a dynamic material because that's the only way you can edit materials at runtime, like parameters inside of them. They need to be dynamic material instances. So we're going to say create dynamic material instance. And it wants the parent, which is just the material that we're trying to create an instance of. So it's going to be our m underscore circular progress bar. And then we want to save this value. So right click on the return value and say promote to variable. And I'm going to rename this to our circle material instance. And then we want to take this value and set it to our circular image. So we want to drag in our circular image and say set brush from material. And then the material we want to set it to is this guy. So just hook it up like that. Just kind of drag this around to make it a little leaner. So again, all we're doing right here is we're taking this circular image, which of course is this guy, and we're setting the material on it to be a dynamic material, just so we can edit it. We can edit the percent value of it at runtime. Okay, and then next we want to create two custom events. So we'll say add custom event, and we're going to call this one begin progress. And we're going to make another one, add custom event. We'll call it end progress. So what these events are going to do is they're going to get called from the chest eventually, and when they call begin progress, it's going to start the progress bar ticking up, and then when they call end progress, it's going to stop it and reset it back to 0. So this is how the user is going to control the progress bar. So for begin progress, all we want to do is essentially set a variable that says progress has begun. So over here on the left, we're going to create a variable, and I'm just going to call it progress has begun, question mark. Drag this in and set it to true for begin progress, and drag it in and set it to false for end progress. Just like that. Now inside of the event tick, which we need to define, so right click and say event tick. So inside of here, we only want to do something if the progress has begun. So we'll say progress has begun. We'll create a branch. And if it has begun, then we want to start incrementing the progress. So we need to create a variable to keep track of the current progress. So we'll make a little variable over here. We'll call it progress. Maybe we could call it percent, but it's basically how full the progress bar is from 0 to 1. We want to make it a float. And then we also want to make another variable to determine how quickly the progress bar fills up, or in other words, how long you have to hold down the interact key for. So I'm going to make one more variable and call it the required hold time. And for this variable, we want people to be able to set it, so make sure you don't set it to private or anything like that. But for these two variables, for progress, we can go ahead and set it to private, and for progress bar, we can set it to private as well, because nobody else is going to need access to those. All right, so we want to take the delta time, and we want to divide it, so float divide. We want to divide it by our required hold time. And what that's going to do is make it so that if they say required hold time is 2, it's going to take it 2 seconds to go from 0 to 1 as opposed to just 1 second. And we want to take that value and we want to add it to our progress. So we'll drag in our progress and we'll say float plus. We want to add that value to it. And then from there, we want to set our progress. Now we could just drag in progress like this and say set and hook this up, right? But I'm actually going to make a little function for this because whenever we update the progress, we also want to update that dynamic material so that the progress bar on the UI updates as well. So I'm just going to make a function called set progress. And then inside of here, if we select this guy, we want to add an input for the progress. So add an input, select float, and we'll call it I'll just call it value. And then we want to take this value that you're going to set it to, and we want to clamp it between 0 and 1 just as a precaution. So we'll say clamp float between 0 and 1, which are the defaults. And then we'll set our progress to that. So drag in progress and hit set that up. And then like I said before, whenever we update the progress, we also want to update the dynamic material instance so that it updates on the UI as well. So we'll drag in our circle material instance, and we're going to call set scalar parameter value. And then it wants the parameter name, which if you remember from our material that we created, which I don't remember where it is. I think we closed it. I'm just trying to show you guys. You don't need to go and open this. But if you look at the progress bar and you look at our parameter here for the percent, we called it percent. So that's the name it's expecting. So we come back here for the parameter name. We want to call it percent. And the value is going to be whatever our progress is, like so. Compile and save that. And then we can go back to the event graph. And right here, we can just call oops, not that. We can call set progress, so drag in set progress, hook it up to true, and hook up the value that we calculated. And then finally, we want to check if the progress bar has been fully filled up. And we'll know that it's fully filled up whenever the progress gets to 1. So we can drag in progress and say equals, or equal. And we can just say equal float. And I know some people might be thinking you shouldn't check equality on floats because of floating point error, but this is actually totally safe to do because if you remember from our set progress, we're actually clamping it between 0 and 1, so it's going to get set to 1 exactly. So we can check if it's exactly equal to 1 without any issue. We can say branch. So if it equals 1, that means the progress is full. And at this point, we just want to notify anybody who's using this widget that the progress has filled up. Because remember, right now we're inside of this widget. We're not inside of the chest, so we can't like open the chest right here. We just want to let whoever owns this widget, in this case the chest, know that the progress has finished. So for something like that, we're going to use an event dispatcher. And what an event dispatcher is it's just an event that you can create. And whenever something happens, you can just say, hey, call this event. I don't really care who's listening for it. Just let them know that something has happened. And then anybody who subscribes to that event, and in this case the chest, will get notified, and they can do whatever they want. So over here on the left, under the variables, there's this little event dispatcher tab. So we want to select this event dispatcher to add a new one. We're going to call this on progress bar full. And we'll just drag this in and say call. And again, we don't really know who, we don't really know who is listening for this event, but we don't really care inside of this widget. All we know is that we're just letting them know that, hey, it's full, do whatever you want. And that's just the responsibility of this widget. All right, so I think this looks good. The one other thing we're going to want to do here is inside of in progress, in the event that this gets called, and this is going to get called if somebody walks away from the chest while they're opening it, or if they let go from the interaction key before they finish opening it. In that event, we want to reset the progress. So we're going to say set progress to 0. Otherwise, the progress will just remain where it was the last time you were there, which you probably don't want, but maybe you do. But if you don't, then just say set progress and pass in 0 like that. Okay, so now we have our little progress, or our little search widget set up, and it knows how to do the whole circular thing. So we can go back to our chest now. And let's see, where did we leave this off? I'm going to delete all these because they annoy me. We don't use them usually. Okay, so this is where we left off. So what we want to do is we want to add that widget to our chest. So if we come to our viewport tab here, we want to add it so that it kind of pops up above and to the right. And the reason it looks so dark is just because the way the lighting is in this. So we'll say add component, and we want to add a widget. So we'll select widget. And then wherever you drag this guy is where the widget will show up. So I'm going to set it like over here. Oops, come on. Somewhere like down here. I kind of looked at how Fortnite did it, like where they put their widget, and they kind of put it like in the side of it. And then we want to change it to screen space. And we want to change the widget class to be our search widget. And then we want to set the draw size to draw at desired size. So make sure you check this checkbox. And then we want to set the pivot to 0 on the X, and that will make it so that it pivots on the left side since it's on the, or since the left side of the widget is touching the crate or whatever. That's why we want it to pivot there. We can compile and save this. And if we run this right now, you should see that this widget is just going to show up. So if we play it, you can see the widget is just kind of always, I'm on the wrong side of it. The widget is just kind of always there on this side of it. And of course, you can move this widget to be wherever you want and look however you want. But right now, it just always shows up. So obviously, we want to make this widget show up when you get close enough to it to actually search it. And fortunately, since we did that part at the beginning, that's going to be pretty easy to do. So by default, we want to set this guy to not be visible. So if we come over here to the details panel and search for visibility, we want to set visible to false by default. And you can see if we run this now, you can't see it. And that's because we're going to be turning it on through code. So if we go back to the event graph, inside of here, we want to come down to our on overlap begin and end events, and we can delete these print strings since we know it's working. And we basically want to set the visibility of it whenever we overlap with it and remove it when we don't. So drag in the widget and say set visibility, and we'll set it to true whenever we begin overlap. I'm just going to copy this and paste, and we're going to set it to false whenever we stop overlapping. So now if we run this, we overlap with it, it shows up, and then it goes away. Right, so that works pretty well. But we want to make use of, or we want to be able to hold down the E key to start spinning it. So to do that, let's go back to the third person character, and we'll start adding the logic for that. So we're going to create a input event. So let's go up here to the edit project settings and go to input. And then under action mappings, we're going to add one for interact. And you can set this to whatever key you want. I would recommend E since that's what we put in the widget. And if we scroll down, select E. So E is our interact key. So now if we come back to our third person character and say input interact, we can define that event. So anytime they press the E key, this event is going to get called. So again, what we want to do here is we want to figure out which interactable object we are currently close enough to, if any, and we want to call on begin interact, or on interact begin for that specific object. So we want to take our sphere. Remember, this is the sphere that's around our character that's detecting things we overlap with. And we want to say, give me everything that I'm overlapping with. So get overlapping actors. And for the class filter, we're just going to select actor just so it gives us everything it hits. And we want to loop over these, but we want to break out as soon as one of them meets our criteria of being an interactable object. So we're going to use a for each loop, except we want to use this for each loop with break so that we can break out of it. So for each loop with break, and hook that up to pressed. And then we want to drag off of this guy, and we want to say, does this guy implement the interact interface? So we'll say does implement interface. And then for the interface, we want to select the interact interface. And we'll drag off this and create a branch to check if it's true. Oops. Didn't mean to do that. Check if it's true. So if it is true, like I said before, we want to take this guy. So I'm going to make a little reroute node, drag him down here, and drag off this and say on interact begin. Hook that up to true. And then actually one thing we want to do before this is we want to save this guy. So I'm going to make another reroute node, right click, and say promote to variable. And we'll call this the interact actor. So this is going to be the actor that we're currently interacting with, if any. We want to save that real quick, and then we'll just drag that over there like that. Oops, just want that. There we go. So again, when we press the interact key, we are getting all the actors that we're overlapping with. We're finding the first one that implements the interact interface. We're saving it, and then we're calling on begin, or on interact begin. And then once we've called that, we want to go back and drag this and then go all the way left and hook it up to the break. And I'm just going to add some reroute nodes here to make it a little bit more visually clear what's going on. You can see it's just looping all the way around and breaking out of that for loop so it stops running. And again, we want to do that because we only want to be able to interact with one thing at once. We don't want to be able to open two chests at the same time by holding down E. Okay, so that's our begin interact, but we also want the end overlap in the event that they let go of the E key before it's fully charged. So I'm just going to move this left a little bit. So when they release it, we want to check if this interact actor is valid. So if we drag this in and we say get, and then we right click and we say convert to the validated get, it will convert it for us to a validated get, and we'll hook it up to released. We want to say if this is valid, then we want to call on interact end. So we'll drag off this and say on interact end. If it is valid, make sure you hook it up to is valid. And then either way, we want to set this. So drag this in and set to nothing. And make sure that you also hook it up to is not valid. So I'm just going to create a little reroute node and hook it up to both of them. And the reason you need to do this, I think you need to do this because I think it's possible that it could be not valid, but also not set to nothing. Just to be safe, we'll do it in both cases. So that is that, pretty straightforward. So now if we come back to our chest, we can implement these on interact end and on interact begin events because those are actually being called now. So over here on the left, you can see we've already done these two bottom ones, but now we can do the two top ones. So we'll right click, say implement, and implement. And we'll implement both of these guys. All right. Let me think. I'm trying to just think of a good way to do, or a good order to do this in, because I'm looking at my other project, trying not to be too confusing. All right, so one thing I want to do real quick is, because this is kind of important, we're going to create a variable to keep track of if the chest is currently already open. So make a variable on the left here, and we'll call it open question mark, and we can set it to private. I'm also just going to move it to a private category by just typing in private here. And then we're going to make a little macro to help us out. It's going to be super simple. So create a little macro here and call it closed. And all this is going to do is just switch true or false depending on if open is set or not. And it's just going to make our code cleaner. So drag in open and do a branch and hook this up to this. And true and false, except we want to reverse these. So make sure you do this correct, otherwise your code will have problems because the variable name is open, but this macro is called closed just because closed is a little bit more helpful when we're going to be using it later because we're mostly going to be checking if this is true. So that's why I have it this way. So make sure you do this correctly. I know it's a little bit confusing, but make sure you have that set up correct. All right, and then back in the event graph, we want to start making use of this. So we want to change this a little bit, the event on overlap begin. We only want to set this widget to visible if it's closed. So if we drag in this closed macro, we just hook it up here in between them. And this way, it's only going to do this if closed is true. And you can see that's why I called it closed and not open, just so we could drag off the true and not the false, just because it's a little bit cleaner, I think. Yeah, we'll make use of this macro more later. But for now, I just wanted to kind of set that variable up since it was kind of important. All right, so then the event on interact begin, we also want to check if it's currently closed, because if it's already open, then like obviously we don't want to try to open it again or anything like that. So if it's currently closed, we want to begin the progress on the progress bar if we're trying to overlap with it, or we're trying to interact with it. So we'll drag in our widget, and if you look at this, or if you hover over it, it says this is just a widget component. It doesn't really know that it's specifically our search widget. So in order to get access to our search widget, we need to say get user widget object. And then we need to cast it to our search widget. So cast to, if I can type, cast to search widget. And we'll hook that up to the true, like that. And then from here, we can call our begin progress event that we made before. And then likewise for the end on overlap, or for the event on interact in, we want to basically do the same thing, except we want to call it end progress. So I'm just going to copy all of this and paste. And then instead of calling begin progress, we're going to call end progress, just like that. File and save all. And yeah, I think that is pretty close to being done. So one more thing we need to do real quick. Well, actually, let's just go ahead and run this so we can kind of see where we're at right now. So let's hit play. Come over here. It's popping up when we get close. It's going away when we get far away. If we hold down the E key, oh, nothing happens. Why does nothing happen? begin progress. That sets that. Let me just put a breakpoint here. You don't have to do this because I'm just trying to figure out what's wrong. So that gets called. And then we call set progress. Oh, this is probably why. So the required hold time probably should be set to something other than 0. Select required hold time, set it to something like 1 second. Let's see if that fixes it. It might or it might not. There we go. So you can see we hold down E and the circular thing fills up. And then when I let go, it goes away. And then I can just keep doing this over and over. But the chest doesn't quite open yet. And that's because, well, it's for a couple reasons, but mainly because we're not making use of that event dispatcher that we created for when the chest gets open. We're not actually listening for it, and so we have no idea that the chest is actually being opened inside of the chest class. So up here, go back to the chest blueprint. So up here at the top of the chest blueprint, we want to make use of the begin play, and inside of there we want to bind to that event so that we know when the chest is opened. And we also want to do a couple other things, but that's the main thing. So event, begin play, make this guy, and we want to do the same thing we did down here for this widget, where we get it and we cast it. So I'm just going to copy these 3 nodes, copy and paste, hook it up to begin play. So now we have our search widget. The one thing you can do here, if you want to have it set up this way, is you can call set required hold time, which is that variable I just set before. If you want to be able to control this, like, inside of your chest as opposed to the widget itself, like maybe you have a chest that takes longer to open than other chests, you could set that right here to something else. I'm just going to set it like 1.25 or something like that. But again, the main thing we want to do here, create a little reroute node, is we want to bind to that on progress bar full event. So we'll say assign on progress bar full. And by default, it creates the bind function node, like this blue one here. It creates that, and it also creates this event for you. But in this case, I don't really want this event because I just want it to go ahead and call a function that I'm going to create. So just delete that for right now. And then on the left here, under functions, we're going to just create a little function called open chest, and then go back to where we just were. And then we'll say create event, and we'll select the open chest function that we just created. So basically what that's doing is we're binding this function to this event. So whenever, back in our search widget, whenever this is called, the call on progress bar full, it's going to call this right here, which is going to say, hey, call this function, which is going to call into here. So it's basically calling this function from the widget, which is pretty nifty. All right, so open chest, the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the chest is not currently opened again. So we'll drag in our little closed macro. And we say, hey, is it closed? And if it is closed, then we're going to set our open variable to true because we are opening it. And then we want to set this widget visibility to false because we don't want the little search widget to be shown anymore. So we're going to drag in this widget and say set visibility. And we want to set it to false, so just make sure you leave that as false. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to start a little timeline that's going to actually rotate the top of the chest so that it opens up correctly. Now, you can't actually create a timeline inside of a function like this. You'll notice if you try to search for add timeline, it just kind of laughs at you and doesn't actually do anything. But if you go to the event graph and you right click and you say add timeline, you can add one here. So we're going to add one here and then we're going to call it from that function. So add a timeline, and we're just going to call this the open chest timeline. And we'll come back and fill this out in a second, but first go back to the open chest function. And if you right click now and you search for that timeline, so open chest timeline, you can actually use it as a variable, which is kind of neat. So open chest timeline, we'll call play from start. So that's basically just going to start that timeline. So now if we go back to our event graph, we can fill out this timeline with what we want it to do. So the first thing is we need to set a time for it, like a duration, how long we want it to take for the chest to open. So if we double click on this, we can set the length to 0.4, 0.4 seconds to open. And then we can add a float curve. So add this guy, and then rename it to the rotation, since that's what it's going to be. And if we go back to our viewport and we take a look at our chest here, so we want the chest to open like this, right? And to do that, you'll notice it's rotating around this green, which is the y-axis. So we want to rotate it on the y-axis, and we want to rotate it about, I don't know if that's going to, we might run into a problem here because I did it differently in my tutorial. We'll see if this works. But we want to rotate it about 120 degrees. Hold on. Let's see if this works. This might not work. I hope this works. Rotate it 120 degrees. So we'll try that. So make sure you leave it here. I was just showing you what was going on. So back in our event graph, we want to drag in our chest top and say set relative rotation. Hook it up to the update. And we want to split the rotation. And we want to hook it up to our y value, because that's the green one. So hook it up to the y one. But we never actually finished this. So go back inside of here. Sorry, I got sidetracked. So we want to add 2 keyframes. We want to add one at 0, 0. So right click and say add curve or add key. And we want to set it to 0, 0 up here at the top. And then we want to add another one. So right click just somewhere else, add another one, and set the time to 0.4, which is the end of the time. And then the value to 120, because that's how much we want it to rotate. And if you hit these 2 little buttons, it will kind of make it so that you can see what's going on a little bit better. And then you compile and save. Go back to the event graph. And let's go ahead and actually give this a try and kind of see what happens, because it might not work. We'll see. Let's come over here, hold down E. Oh, that worked. Okay, cool. I knew it was going to work. So it opens, and everything is good to go. Now, actually, let me double check. Did I get everything correct? Open, goes away. That looked like it worked correctly. And if I don't hold it down, that works. If I walk away, that works. Okay, so it looks like everything is working correctly. I was kind of making sure I didn't forget anything. So that's like the gist of it. I'm going to make a part 3 here if you want to stay tuned. If you're like over it by now, you can just go ahead and like and subscribe and leave. But in the next part of the tutorial, I'm just going to add some little particle effects and a little light that turns on. Like nothing critical, just a little fluff to add to it to make it look nicer. Because I think at this point, the actual tutorial is finished. I'm just trying to make sure. I don't think I forgot anything. So yeah, if you enjoyed the tutorial, please leave a like and subscribe. Feel free to stay tuned for part 3. We're just going to add a little bit of fluff to it. It's going to be pretty easy. But if not, then I'll see you in the next tutorial.